Welcome to We Need to Talk About, a thing where I talk about things that I think we need to talk about. Today, in this episode, we need to talk about that fucking election that just happened, part two, part one. So I say part two, part one, because I think I'm going to need to record a part two of part two, as well as a part one of part two. The reason for this is that I think I need to devote a special amount of time to explaining the significance and the importance of professional wrestling to the 2024 presidential elections. So I will uh, continue that uh, possibly next week. Uh, so last week I talked about the importance of imperialism and war and genocide in presidential politics. Um, Not many people watched or listened to that, which is a great pity because, well, it hurts my feelings, obviously, but also because I am actually taking a different approach, and I've consumed an awful lot of postmortems of the election, and there are certain shared assumptions amongst all of them, and I think that given that as I'm just about to discuss, we're talking about a problem that can be traced back to 1944. That is 80 years ago. I think maybe it is time that people try to think of things a little bit differently and try and escape the frameworks that are not working because they're not. We're not solving the problem by continuing to view um, each party, the dynamics of the election as being dominated by uh, oppositional party politics. So yeah, so I will continue in that vein. So I think the first thing to I'll just recap the fact that the Democrats didn't try and win that election. Obviously there's a lot of evidence of that. They had an enormous amount of money to spend, and they spent a lot of it on campaigning against the Greens, who, given that they do a lot of polling themselves, they would have known weren't really much of a factor in the outcome of the presidential election, or any other election either. So the spending to oppose the Greens is serving a different purpose. Maybe it's about strategizing for the future to fend off a potential threat in the future. But of course, if you want to look at it that way, the threat they're fending off is really a threat that they would have to become responsive to the electorate, because they have plenty of room to outmaneuver the Greens, should the Greens start to gain some traction, simply by adopting some of their popular policies and then saying, well, we'll do this. You don't need to vote for the Greens, and we are more credible because of the two-party system. We can get elected and do this. So the fact that they're campaigning hard, spending money against the Greens, is actually an indication where their priorities lie. And Yeah, I think we can also, I mean, as people have pointed out, the behaviour in Michigan was tantamount to trying to give the election to Trump. I know it's only one swing state, but it is a swing state, and they sent whereas Trump met with local politicians and so forth and did a bit of outreach. Um, the Harris campaign sent Bill Clinton to tell them that the reason people were being killed in Gaza was because of Hamas using human shields, and to say that Hamas should realize that Jews had been there 3,000 years ago. It was basically really offensive, horrible stuff. They also sent Richie Torres, who is who very proud of his being a prominent supporter of Israel. I think he's said something along the lines of he's the number one supporter in his caucus or something like that. And Liz Cheney, the daughter of Dick Cheney, someone who was a Republican, possibly still is, and so forth. So a lot of the approach of the Democrats was to try and appeal to Republicans, even though analysis shows that registered Republicans always vote, well, almost always vote along party lines, even though they might express some discomfort with Donald Trump being their candidate. They're still party loyalists, So I mean, I think that is an indication that they weren't campaigning to win, given the size of the amount of money they spent and the easy paths they had to win. I mean, they didn't just double down on supporting Israel in the middle of a genocide. They actually chose not to highlight those aspects of their existing policy that might have attracted some of the anti-genocide voters. So, for example, there's sanctions against settlers and policies on that front, and they certainly could have done more in that area to win votes if they'd wanted to. And so, I mean, what I think the way I want to start this is go back into the past again a little bit with the Democrats, because again, as I mentioned, it goes back 80 years, and those who've watched The Untold History of the United States or read the book The Untold History of the United States. It's a 10-part documentary by Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznick, an historian. It's quite a densely packed, very informative documentary. Lots of stuff in it. I apologise if you hear traffic noise, by the way. I don't have a studio. I just have to do what I have to do. And there is an accompanying book, which is even more stuffed full of facts. So it begins really with the Democratic Party nobbling George. What was his name? Wallace. George Wallace. Reasonably sure that's his name. He was vice president under Franklin D. Roosevelt, and this was in the going into the 1944 election. So, of course, at the time, as people might be aware from maybe watching the movie Oppenheimer or other things, the Depression followed by the New Deal, followed further by World War II and the alliance between the Soviets and the US and Britain and so forth, had opened up space for left-wing politics to be normal, more or less normal in day-to-day, in the day-to-day world. It wasn't something you had to whisper about so much, and it wasn't simply confined to working class people in unions. Plenty of middle class people had become left-wing, and Wallace, I don't know if I've got his first name correct, because I keep thinking of William Wallace, the um, Scots rebel. But anyway, Wallace was a kind of an expression of this. He was a left-wing person, not a flaming Marxist or anything like that, but he was a genuine left-wing person. And the establishment really didn't like that, and so they needed to get rid of him. Franklin D. Roosevelt was obviously not going to survive the full term of his presidency, so that whoever was nominated as vice president was essentially being nominated as the president at some point. So they nobbled that uh, uh, selection process in scenes that we've seen quite a few different iterations of this party choosing ways of destroying the democratic input into the choice of candidates. So it was merely the first iteration of that, but the scenes would become quite familiar in some ways. So yeah, and of course, last time I talked about how they had uh, continued this sort of behaviour. Now, obviously, in 19, 1960, they nominated John F. Kennedy, who was killed, and then Johnson sort of cruised in as the incumbent after having taken over. Again, like as I said, masquerading as the anti-war candidate. And there is, there are among the many things that may have led to Kennedy's death. One thing that certainly shouldn't be discounted is the idea that even though he had seemed to be quite the cold warrior when he campaigned to become president, once in office, there were definitely times where he seemed to not be quite so keen on the whole empire project, and he may well have balked at what the US was planning to do in Indochina. So that could be one of the reasons. Well, could be the reason why he was killed. Who knows? Anyway, so we got this fake anti-war candidate, then loses the election to another fake anti-war candidate, Richard Nixon, in 1968. Then in 1972, the Democrats, of course, nobbled their own real anti-war candidate, Eugene McCarthy, for 1968. Then in 1972, because people were the counterculture had really taken off. People were very anti-war. The mood had changed. The Democrats nominated George McGovern. In a way, it's probably quite inevitable if there was, until they had gotten rid of all aspects of democracy from their candidate selection. So again, like part of a process, I think, of getting rid of these loopholes where they might accidentally be an anti-imperialist come to power. So like McGovern was the candidate, but the money decided that it didn't like him. But more importantly than that, I think that, these parties, they have apparatchiks in them, and they are, because the money wasn't as big or as important back then, I think, but the machinery is quite important. I don't know the details, but the fact that I would imagine it's a little bit like what happened with the sort of Blairites hating Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. There's a certain sort of person who really doesn't doesn't believe in believes strongly that left-wing politics are dangerous, that democracy is dangerous, and that these things are just the sort of nonsense that you feed the public. So they're involved in these parties that pretend that, as far as they're concerned, only posture as being on the left. They consider it to be merely a posture for winning support. If you study classics at university, you're very likely to be taught that this was the way the Roman populares were, the people who um, sought to reform oligarchic distemper in the Roman Republic, which was basically destroying everything, and look after the welfare of the people. If you're very likely to find that your textbooks and your lecturers in classics will tell you that the only reason that these people like the Gracchus brothers, the Marius, and Gaius Julius Caesar, the famous Julius Caesar, whatever, the only reason that they ever pretended to be on the side of the people was because the people were a source of political power. So this is kind of like you get that with and it's definitely in UK politics. If you look at the way people come through Cambridge, for example, particularly Cambridge, with their student politics and this thing of taking one side or the other and trying to win debates and win elections through this, then you're being trained to view all of the politics as instrumentalized, so that you go into these parties merely as this is merely a means to an end, where the real politics is a backroom deal between elites, basically aristocrats, uh, uh, aristocrats masquerading as Democrats. So this is I think a large number of the people in that sort of party are like that. So and we often people when they're commenting, they're trying to work out what they're not even trying to work out. They're asserting that certain people think such and such a thing, or think this, think that. And of course, politicians, even the best of them, are maybe dishonest by nature, at least at times. They have to put on masks at times. It's the nature of the beast. And a lot of them, that's all they do. They're only a mask, The actual person isn't really something that that the public or a pundit is likely to see. Yet we have a lot of people saying, such and such thinks this, or such and such does things because of this personality trait or that personality trait. So for me, the most annoying at the moment is the people who go on TV and talk about Donald Trump's foreign policy by saying, well, he's a deal maker and he loves to make deals, and this will be his, and it's like, you're talking shit, absolute fucking shit. Donald Trump isn't even a real person. Like, Donald Trump, there is a real person called Donald Trump, but it's not the person you see on the screen. And I'll return to this in the next episode when I talk about the wrestling thing. But I did mention a bit about how LBJ kind of had a persona that he used to kind of create a record that he wanted. Not necessarily a flattering one, but a misleading one. And, I think there is a Donald Trump, and then there's the Donald, there's a character that he plays. And one of the things of what makes him so useful is that everything he says is instrumentalized. So you can't tell that much about future policy from what he says because he's always quite exaggerated and melodramatic, but also because it's not decided when he's saying it. Almost certainly. I mean, a lot of the stuff, he knows he can say it and then not follow through on it. So he says it for effect, and then, like, people will decide later what the policy actually is. And it won't be just one person. It's not him. He's not a dictator, despite his own rhetoric. Of course, that's part of the act too. I mean, he is, like all of these people, they're a front person for a large group concern, they're the product, and he is exceptionally good as this product. In fact, I mean, I'd say the Donald is like a simulacrum. I remember once a rhetoric professor described George W. Bush as the first president for Foucault because he saw something in his style of governance that fit ideas of biopower and stuff like that. Well, maybe not. Actually, I'm not. I can't remember what it was that he saw. But anyway, the point is that I think you could say that the Donald is like the first president for Baudrillard. He's a simulation of a politician, and he always was. He never, he never, like, um, he never went, I want to be a politician to begin with. He thought, well, if I was going to be a politician, how would I do it? And we've seen, there's a movie out now about his, I haven't seen it, but his apprenticeship under Roy Cohn, which is very much about that kind of instrumentalized approach to things, to create a persona to be effective. And, this is nothing new. I mean, this is, how to win friends and influence people and so forth. This is this very, let's say, it was something that came out of the United States very much, this idea that you change who you are to effectuate what you want. And it is kind of like, it's weirdly antithetical to being self-actuated. It's like you become a tool of your own, well, what the self-help book writer wants you to be, really, in the end. The ideology of someone who writes self-help books. Anyway, and it does, I mean, because of his exaggerated style, he is really good for this because he doesn't have to follow through. And I mean, that I actually, like last time I mentioned, because again, a lot of these politics, a lot of these electoral politics are about expectations. It's not about whether you have to follow through on a policy just because you campaigned on it. Like, you can lie to people and get them to vote for you, but it's the price that you pay if you change your mind. So if they don't expect you to follow through on it, you don't pay a price. So it's not a problem. So I mentioned about John Kerry. I said he was a fake anti-war candidate, and I think they rigged the election against him, and it had nothing to do with what he was going to do. It was because him being president would cause people to have expectations that the war in Iraq would be wound up quickly. That's what they would be voting for. So that's why he was a danger, not anything to do with him as a person. So, so, I mean, it's not just Trump. Like, I'm going to read you a quote here from the vice president-elect. We have built a foreign policy of hectoring, moralizing, and lecturing countries that don't want anything to do with it. China has a foreign policy of building roads, bridges, and feeding poor people. One of the biggest problems in America, this is a separate quote. One of the biggest problems in America is socialized costs but privatized profits. Now, this is J.D. Vance talking. He's saying, on the one hand, that the US has to be less less domineering in its foreign policy and more helpful to people. Um, and in another that he's saying that they're saying something that many centre-left parties wouldn't say, that there is a problem of socialised costs and privatised profits. It would be difficult for a Democrat candidate to say that and then exercise power and not follow through on it, whereas it is easy for a Republican candidate to say those sorts of things and not follow through on them. One of the tricks is with their isolationism, their America First policies, is that it's actually contingent on nothing ever happening that they might then exploit to say, oh, but this is different this time. We need to, So, as someone's pointed out, there are a whole bunch of neocons who've rebranded themselves as American Firsters going into Trump's cabinet. And as I pointed out last time, George W. Bush was an isolationist American Firster to begin with, and yet he became the vehicle for the greatest explosion of neocon interventionism in the world. Now, I want to just quickly point out there is no opposition between neoconservatism and neoliberalism. This is a weird conceit that I find that some people have in the US, and possibly it's spread from there. They're not separate ideas. There is no, neoconservatives are not opposed to liberalism in any respect. For example, and they're not confined to one party either. The label changes. So we had, and sometimes there's, a different emphasis in gender as well. So, for example, Robert Kagan is a prominent neoconservative. He gave a talk once where he said to a bunch of educated elite people, he's laughed with them about the fact that people don't understand that he's a liberal. He called himself a classical liberal, and they're all ha ha ha. They think that the stupid plebs think that liberals and neoconservatives are different things. Even though, one of the most prominent neoconservatives in the Bush era was Francis Fukuyama, also one of the world's most prominent liberals who wrote the book The End of History, about the triumph of liberalism over all other things. And of course, Robert Kagan's wife is Victoria Nuland, who is worked for the Obama administration, and is associated with the Democrats and liberalism, but has pursued a foreign policy of interventionism that is entirely neoconservative. So the nature of well, one of the things about neoconservatism is it's allied to an approach to politics which we can associate with an author called Leo Strauss, a political theorist who believed in kind of putting on a political mask. Now, I was actually going to mention this more in the. I'll probably go into it again when I talk about professional wrestling, but the thing is that the idea of this sort of politics is this is a mask you never take off. You live it. It's method acting sort of thing. It's political kayfabe, to use a wrestling term. So instead of being like a role you play when the curtain goes up and then you put away when the curtain goes down, this is a role you play whenever someone is looking. So, and that is a style that neoconservatives adopt. They believe in conservative messages as a way. Social conservatism, for example, they think of it as an instrument for controlling public opinion. So the culture wars in the US, of course, are two sides of two sides using liberal and illiberal social policies to contend with each other when they, in fact, agree on the basics of fundamental economic positions and foreign policy, imperialism, and all the other nasty shit that I keep going on about. And you know, there's that kind of fits both sides. Again, what I was talking about with the Blairite Labour people, you know, the elites coming out of Cambridge who never really believe in the politics of Labour. They merely spout it like their populares in Rome are said to have. Anyway, so you have this fake opposition. And so the Republicans run, and it's this kind of, again, a different style of fake anti-war stuff. You know, there's a lot of fake anti-war stuff in US politics. So using the ideas of isolationism and America first, but they can switch it off straight away because the people that appeals to are people who are chauvinistic in their outlook, and basically you just need to say, well, these other people did something horrible to us, or they're threatening us, and they're immediately back into going to war. There's one person put it, you know, you tell the people they're being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. And that was how Goering explained how you could always get people to support war. And national security, of course, is like an untouchable piety for these people. They use it as a thought-stopping piety. You just, whenever you want to end a conversation, you just talk about national security. So Tom Homan, who is going to be in charge of some aspect of immigration, is he going to be ICE? Anyway, nominated by Trump to be that. He was he's worked in border security before. When he was interviewed on 60 Minutes, and he was questioned about the horrors of splitting families up and deporting them, and with this planned mass deportation that's on the table, which may or may not happen. I personally think the threat is more important than to the Republicans than the actuality would be, but who knows? I mean, it's I wouldn't. It's hard to predict what they would consider to be too much, but they can't. Yeah, at the moment, it's hard to imagine that they would actually go ahead with deporting millions and millions of people en masse. But anyway, when he was pushed on the question of that, he said he defended it by saying, "What price do you place on that? Do you put on national security?" And of course, he's basically trying to end the argument with that. There is no. It's a religious argument. It's a faith-based argument. He's not saying we've got evidence that these people, we've got empirical evidence that they threaten national security, and we've got empirical evidence that we can solve that by deporting them en masse. He's using it instead to shut a conversation down. And security conscious nationalism is kind of the religion of the US. With these kind of crackpot realists are the high priests. They're the people who saw the Reds under the beds. They're the people who believe that all Muslims are terrorists, and not only that, their fanaticism makes them almost superhuman in their abilities and their wiles and their untrustworthiness, and this is why you have to torture them. And then they come up with scenarios like the ticking time bomb scenario and so forth. They basically the 1% doctrine, which was the doctrine that Donald Rumsfeld uh, uh, um, propounded for viewing the threat of terrorism. He is an example of this, a deliberate one. I mean, this is a conscious manipulation on his part. He's basically saying that if there's a conceivable risk, you have to act as if that risk were real. So this is kind of fueling a paranoid, crackpot realist view of the world. So the Republicans kind of position themselves as being the kind of isolationists who speak softly and carry a big stick, like Theodore Roosevelt, and the Democrats position themselves as kind of the nanny of the world, where they have to stop all the bad things from happening in the world that the bad people are doing by intervening. But the actual policy is the same between them. They're not really different. I think there is, well, actually, that's not true. There is a bit of a difference in that, I think the Republicans are less interventionist, and that's mainly because they are more threatened by the public activation of the Democrats' base. Whereas if the Democrats do the intervention, their own base is kind of nobbled. The Democrats, the people who support them, tend to be the ones who are the least into war out of the two, even though, obviously Republicans do play the anti-war card all the time. But they do it in that kind of isolationist, or it's not worth our time, our blood and treasure sort of thing. Whereas the principled anti-war people tend to be more in the Democrats' camp. So when the Democrats wage war, they just, as we've seen a million times, they basically shut their own people up by saying, "Well, what do you want? Though, do you want George W. Bush? Do you want Dick Cheney? Do you want?" Well, actually, they actually sort of changed a little bit on that one. But do you want do you want Donald Trump, and so forth? yes, it does actually. It is a measure of how far things have shifted. That they now embrace Dick Cheney, of course, but that is part of the whole point of it. Is that they're shifting the goalposts, they're changing the Overton window. So, uh, and again, this is, I think, part of why I think both. Well, I think that Kerry was an unacceptable choice um, to the real managers of politics. So perception is very important, but as I said, you don't have to worry if no one has an expectation of you. If no one expects anything, then you don't have to worry about their backlash against you not fulfilling it. And I think one of the things that the Democrats have been doing, and specifically in this recent election, is to reduce everyone's expectations down to nil. Right? They are taking the politics out of the elections, as I've said before. So, uh, so the way of you're basically like using this cover of this manipulated culture war and basically squeezing out any real choice. Um, and yeah, and it kind of it works also to get people to really psychologically sign off on horrors. So, I mean, this I think is very clear with the genocide in Gaza that um, the Democrats, so as I have said before, they're so ostentatious about their support that they made it very clear that a vote for them was a vote for genocide. And I don't think that's unintentional. And if they wanted more votes, all they had to do was soft pedal that part. They did it on purpose. Now, did they want Donald Trump to win the election? I don't know. But were they willing to sacrifice the election to Donald Trump in order to make sure that people understood that they couldn't vote against genocide? Yes, they were. And were they willing to kind of turn people into these kind of blue MAGA, like, like the woman shouting in a baby's face, um, I don't care about Gaza, or the people leaving the DNC, like blocking their ears because they didn't want to hear about the children dying, yeah. I mean, I think that the Democrats are basically, people talk about Bernie Sanders being a sheepdog, but the whole fucking party is a kind of a sheepdog. It's a way of taking leftist politics and capturing it and killing it, burying it in a fucking pit. That's the whole point. They want to kill the leftist and save the voter, more or less. And so, I mean, I think it's a type of fascism as well. This is a two-party fascism, but it is really the two parties are not separate. And like I referred to it in a piece I wrote as managed fascism, and I've seen someone else has written a book where they refer to post-fascism. And I want to deal with something that, Norman Finkelstein said something that said something that makes a certain amount of sense on the surface. He said that there is no fascism in the US because fascism arises to in response to a threat of socialism. So, and this is true. I think that um, all the fascist characteristics existed before Mussolini invented fascism per se. So, for example, the Ku Klux Klan really had all of the standard fascist characteristics before there was such a thing as fascism. So all of that can exist, but I think the success of fascism came when when capitalists saw it and went, right, well, this is the alternative we need, and the point is that it offers a radical path without that is not antithetical to big business, basically. So Italian fascism, I don't know it that well, but it was um, uh, explicitly anti-socialist, whereas obviously Nazis kind of pretended to be socialistic. It's right in the name. They called themselves socialistic. But at the same, but that really, this is just to offer an attractive populist notion to something that in fact would work well for big business. So this, I think, Finkelstein has a good point. Is making a good point about fascism historically. What I think is the difference is that there hasn't been strong socialist movements, but this is a process that's been happening for decades, and they're always a threat, and the threat um, has been continually fought against by becoming slowly more and more fascistic, until such a point where it's indistinguishable now. People might not feel that, but I nor did the people living under fascism. In fact, there was a famous book where um, someone interviewed 10 Germans after World War II and asked them what their opinion of Hitler was, talking about the years between 33 and 45. And only one out of the 10, this is an oral history, only one out of the 10 felt that there was any sort of oppression going on, and the others, felt life was fine and dandy. And the book was called They Thought They Were Free. So, if you can think you were free living in the Third Reich, you can think you're free anywhere if the regime is promoting your sense of freedom. So these were obviously good Aryan Jews, or good Aryan Germans, sorry, good Aryan Germans who felt they were free. Of course, other people of other origins wouldn't necessarily have felt they were free at the time. Oh, my tongue is playing up a wee bit, I'm afraid. Anyway, so this leads to a situation like this sort of two-party fascism, this managed fascism, this pure instrumentalism in politics or depoliticization depoliticization of the electoral process. This all kind of is of a piece, and kind of acts to corrupt the public as well by getting them to basically sign on to the idea that they care more about the price of eggs than they care about children being crushed and incinerated in Gaza. So, yeah, I just want to make one other note about the Republican anti-war claims, and that is that Tulsi Gabbard has been nominated to be Director of Central Intelligence. Now, she has a background in the military in psychological operations and intelligence, and she has been an outspoken anti-interventionist of the sort of, kind of walking that line between being a selfish isolationist and a principled anti-war sort of voice, trying to play it both ways. I wouldn't believe that she is either of those things. I think she's a warmonger who is deliberately posing as an anti-war person. So, but yeah, anyway, that was just an aside. Yeah, so, I mean, this is the situation with this sort of fascism is that has two wings of one fascist party is not unique to the United States, and there's levels to which it's also in effect in other countries. And the so-called centre left of in lots of parties is actually highly right wing, and they again like often using these culture war signifiers to create a fake left wing position. So that really they're kind of like fascist with socially liberal characteristics, really, and there is one of the things is that, of course, that whether it's a pretense or it's really part of their internal politics, they are not as radical in their governing style as the right wing can be. So the right wing, which can call itself centre right or right, when it comes into power, they basically just go. They pull out all the stops. And then when they are booted from power, and think of Javier Milei, for example, like he campaigned with a chainsaw to give people a very clear idea of the way he was going to govern. So this is the style: you come in and you just blitz everything. And then when they're voted out, these so-called centre-left people come in and they start doing studies into what can be done about things, and start engaging in processes, and they never undo that much of what has been done. And I said this about they'll campaign against what the right wing does, as Biden campaigned against Trump's actions, but they won't actually really change it. And certainly not in any fundamental way that would transform society. So this is sometimes called a ratchet sort of system because it only goes in one direction. Um, and that's a fair enough analogy, but I'm increasingly think the better way of thinking about it is a saw action. So the saw goes backwards or forwards, but it cuts in one direction only. You know, so and yeah, one cut goes deeper than the other. Um, that's true, but they're still both cutting in the same direction, and eventually they're going to saw right through everything. Um, so um, it kind of keeps this helps them uh, solidify the idea that no real change is possible. Tina, there is no alternative. Um, Again, a reminder that arch conservatives Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were arch liberals. You know, it's, it's they are neoliberals to the core. So there's no opposition between those two things. There's opposition between the concepts of conservatism and liberalism and the history, but the reality is that the two have long since collided and become a single mashup. Um, so, yeah. So people people become demoralized, hopeless. They lose all expectation of improvement. Um, and, these parties keep running unpopular, uninspiring people who don't really um, don't energize any sense that things can change. And this is like if they were wanting to win elections, they wouldn't do that. They would choose someone who mobilizes people and offers them something. But like for Republicans, they can put forward this philandering, bragging criminal who abuses political rivals and colleagues alike, and he's a self-serving narcissist. He has no sense of loyalty. He doesn't seem to have any sort of conscience, and he's a buffoon as well. It's kind of easy for them to get away with that because their followers tend to be um, psychologists refer to as right-wing authoritarians, which is people who want a leader, basically, and he's their daddy. However, for the Democrats, often what's happening seems a lot more like Stockholm syndrome. They're forced to accept these people that they don't like. Kamala Harris got 1% when she ran in the primaries. She didn't win a single state. Biden was also someone who had an attempted presidential career and was uh, very firmly rejected, and then was selected as a vice president by a clearly very popular candidate on the basis that he was meant to balance out the supposed left wing Obama. So he was like Biden was like on the extreme right wing of the Democrat Party. Only I think Joe Lieberman was still a Democrat at that time. Only Joe Lieberman was to the right of him in the Senate, uh, and so that was, and the only reason he ever got to be a presidential candidate again was because of his association with Obama became stronger in the public mind than his association with his own politics, which is quite interesting. So they pick these terrible candidates. Hillary Clinton too. I mean, not not someone who's ever really inspired many people, except when people thought of her purely in the context of her husband's. I mean, I know she was. I think she was voted in more than once as a senator, but her association with her husband's 2 terms probably meant more to people than her own politics, which have never resonated. Put it that way. So yeah, once the person is selected as the leader, then the party faithful just all convince themselves that that this person has no flaws. So the one of the commentators on MSNBC, you may have seen this, was talking after the election, saying that Harris ran a flawless campaign. There's nothing that could possibly have been wrong with the campaign. After all, she had endorsements from a bunch of singers or something like that. Anyway, something like someone endorsed her. Some famous pop singer endorsed her that never endorses anyone. Well, gee, exciting. And they had all that money. I mean, as soon as Kamala Harris was nominated, there was a huge amount of insane celebration over the fact that that donors loved her. She hadn't polled well or anything like that. It was just like, oh my God, the donors just love this choice. This is fantastic. You could watch Seth Meyers or probably the Daily Show, maybe the Daily Show slightly more cynical, but all and Jimmy Kimmel, all that sort of thing. They're just absolutely creaming themselves because they nominated this woman of color, and people with money just started throwing money at her. It's like, wow, yes, money loves her. Excellent. So you end up with a kind of pathetic sight of these people who are psychologically warped by this weird process, then trying to explain why a candidate is incredibly fucked as Donald Trump won an election against this person who's supposedly perfect, and coming up with all sorts of ideas. And I said about the moral degradation the sewing. Like some of them are like, well, I'm going to Starbucks now. I hope you get deported now because you voted for it, and all this sort of thing. It's toxic, disgusting things to say because they're, quite frankly, really bad candidate who campaigned on deporting people and shooting burglars with her gun and getting endorsement from Dick Cheney. And she lost. And then they're like, well, I hope they nuke Gaza because Trump loves Netanyahu. I mean, yeah, it's awful, and it shows what this sort of politics turns people into, and I think that's a function of it. So the parties kind of start to, in some ways, the Democrats and the Republicans kind of become mirrors of each other. Like you have your MAGA and your blue MAGA, and they mirror each other's toxicity. And Naomi Klein actually deals with this a little bit in her book Doppelganger, and it kind of, uh, yeah, I mean, also like Sam Husseini described the election, the impending election just before it. He called it dueling fascisms. But way back in 2016, I wrote something called an article where I said that the USA was 1984 in stereo because of this, like these two sides where they're living in these isolated, uh, with these worldviews that are completely shut off. They're using language that creates a reality that full of hyperbole and extremes and um, uh, the kind of uh, anti-intellectual processes that are kind of are a prerequisite for fascism. They're a foundation of fascism. I mean, the fascism is based on these worldviews of absolutes, you know, um, uh, and we've got this kind of pluralistic uh, fascism going on now, where like some of them are wanting to hang the people who believe in vaccines, and some of them are wanting to hang the people who believe in I don't know what the right wing equivalent of that is. Anyway, the point is that this extremism, this anti-intellectual extremism, is part of it, and the kind of uh, unpopular candidates as well are kind of part of it. So, um, like Trump, his highest ever approval rating while president was 49%. That is record low for anyone's presidential term, right? And that is despite the fact that he gave people free money. Imagine that. Nothing he did, including sending people checks with his name on it, actually got him above 49% approval. And the next record for the lowest high approval rating is Joe Biden. And then, like, we've got Kamala Harris, whose approval ratings as vice president have been, like, from basically hovering from the high 30s to the low 50s. So another person who just never does anything appealing at all. But they put forward these unappealing candidates, and then they have these what seem to be an almost artificially balanced elections where both sides seem to have gentlemen's agreements not to do anything as underhanded as to try and run popular policies and try and win through democratic means. And in fact, they refer to appealing to the electorate as being populism, which and that's not just true in the US. And in fact, it has much more negative connotations outside of the US as well, because it's associated with dictators and fascists. So they refer to trying to win over the electorate and get their votes as being populist, when realistic politics, making yourself electable, means appealing to the donors, the donor class, and that's way more respectable because it's not caught up in this democratic distemper. So they kind of keep this fake balance and then try and tell you that each election is like the most important one of your lifetime, and they keep ramping it up and ramping it up. Again, this is something I'll talk about a little bit next time around when I talk about professional wrestling, because this is, I can't even remember whatever they call their big events, something like WrestleMania or whatever. Each one has to be bigger, than last time, and so forth. Seems to be this like election 2024. This time it's consequential. That sort of mentality. And of course, this was fueled in this instance by the polls being hedging polls. So all the polling companies, whether they're doing this for their own self-interest or whatever, that they want to preserve their reputation by not picking a winner. So they did hedging polls to make everything look like it was right down to the line, So yeah, so yeah, it's a bit of a strange system, and anyway, so the I mean, whether they're colluding in it, I don't know. I feel that someone at some level is colluding. Um, uh, it's just hard to imagine how this could keep happening without some sort of conspiracy, put it that way. And what it means, well, even if that weren't the case, though, if you look at Donald Trump and you think this is terrible, this person should not become president. He shouldn't have been president one time. He definitely shouldn't be president again. What you have to understand is that he is a creation of the elite, the people who run the Democrats, their party, as much as anything else. They created the room for that. Their response to everything is always, we have to move to the right. We have to move to the centre. We have to try and, take some of the sting out of this right-wing stuff by being more right-wing. It was this responsibility to the Tea Party, and, it's been I mentioned Wallace earlier on, but I think also a key point was probably the whole the 1992 election of Clinton and the whole "it's the economy, stupid" thing. This is not. Yeah, he won the election against what? Basically, George Bush Sr. was at this stage essentially the incumbent for a third term in some ways. He was the vice president to Ronald Reagan, who left office as an extremely unpopular figure, very unpopular. And this George Bush guy, a grey non-entity by anyone's standards, famous for being a grey non-entity. His background, of course, may be a little bit more exciting than people like to admit. But anyway, he's not an oozer of charisma, put it that way. And it may well have been, I think it was the 88 election where he campaigned on Willie Horton. I'm not sure. I think it was, anyway, it was, they panicked people into voting for another term of, a Reagan continuation almost. But then, along comes Slick Willie Clinton, And I mean, honestly, as repugnant as the guy is, he certainly seemed like a breath. You can see why people thought he was a breath of fresh air comparatively. Is and they, if you vote for someone who plays the sax and admits to having smoked pot and stuff like that, you're not really thinking you're voting for a horribly conservative government. But they were. This is the this is the people who brought in um, uh, NAFTA, um, the Effective Death Penalty Act, mass incarceration. Um, it was a very conservative party. Now, there may have been some elements of welfareism and developmentalism there, and I think that what people have to understand that is that conservatives will do that if they're pressed hard enough. So there's a suggestion nowadays that sometimes comes out that Otto von Bismarck was left wing, which is extraordinary, really. But in fact, what he was a conservative who took on some liberal characteristics and some developmental characteristics because he wanted to stave off socialism, and also because it actually sometimes serves conservative purposes to to be less laissez-faire, put it that way, but more statist, more developmentalist. So yeah. I mean, when people talk about conservatives these days, they're often referring to fiscal conservatism, which is really more something historically associated with liberalism. So it all gets very confusing when you use these terms, of course. So the yeah, and so I think that. Well, I was saying that Donald Trump is really a product of the the Democrats as much as anything else, and I think one of the problems that we all suffer from is that we're sort of stuck in this kind of schizophrenic world. So, say if you believe in democratic politics, you tend to see something in them that can only be seen by blinding yourself to other things, right? Other things that are right there in front of your face all the time, but you're choosing not to know about them, and you have to in order to maintain your belief that the party is the party that you believe in. And to a large extent, this is true of the Republicans as well, especially I think with Donald Trump, because he so embodies so much that is offensive to actual, social conservatives. They come up with ways of working around it, kind of easing that cognitive dissonance and so forth. But at the same time, I think that people like myself who say there's no difference, whatever. I mean, there is we're also stuck in this weird situation where you kind of know there is a difference. And there is, like, Donald Trump, his cabinet picks are scary. He is scary, in fact. But is he? I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I think of Donald Trump as being like Schrodinger's Pol Pot, because you never know whether what he says is going to be real or not real. And neither does he at the time he says it as well. So we're never going to know until the waveform has collapsed. So is he going to be is 2025 going to be the year zero in the US? Is he going to be rounding up millions and millions of people and sending them to their deaths in his brutal de-education camps, for example? I don't know. But it creates this weird system whereby you kind of know but don't know. This double vision thing is going on. And I think that basically, I want to, I think it's true that people are right to worry that those who are saying not to take Donald Trump seriously are repeating the mistake of history when people said that about Hitler. But it's also true that the Donald, that character, he baits and he trolls Democrats to get them to condemn them over condemn him, and they lose credibility like that crying wolf. This is a point that Eugene Puryear made on the Katie Halper show. They're kind of losing losing people by continuously pointing out what a disaster Donald Trump is going to be. And it's weird because he kind of is. But another thing that Puryear points out is that they're saying that, on the one hand, he is threatening to institute fascism and the end of democracy. But the things he's threatening to do that they cite are things like invoking the 1807 Insurrection Act, or the Enemy Aliens Act, which was from the late 18th century. And it's like, you're saying that he's going to be fascist because he's going to be using these laws that have been on the books for that long that you've left on the books in case you want to use them sometime, because the Congress, the Democrats have controlled the lower house and both houses quite a lot in those intervening 200 years. And if they really thought those laws were dangerous and fascistic, they should have gotten rid of them a long time ago. So, I mean, in the end, though, I think both parties really present more than one image of themselves. They're Janus-like in that, but see, people from different angles see different things. So instead of dog whistling, it's almost more like they're throat singing, and people can only hear one note or another note, but they're singing two different bloody tunes at the same time. And people are blinding themselves to one reality and hearing another reality in both cases. People, honestly, part of people not seeing the flaws in their party is just like plain human cussedness. People are diverse in their reactions to things. If you had a party whose policy was basically to throw anyone who votes for them into a volcano to appease the god of reasonably priced avocados, they'd still get a few votes, I'm sure, because there's always someone out there in that great variety of humanity that will think for some reason that's a good idea. And then you kind of end up with this weird again, this doubling where, like, what's obvious to everyone else isn't obvious to some people. Well, maybe that's a bad example, but another example would be like the Brexit Leave vote and racism. Like, the Leave campaign dog whistled racism so much that it's very difficult for people who opposed Leave to see it as anything other than racist. But it's just a fact that a lot of non-racist people didn't necessarily vote for it out of racism. Yet it's, like Donald Trump, it's hard for other people, not to see the racism as a glaring reality that how could they not see it? I think the same is true of both parties in the US, because the Democrats, their approach to the Middle East is thoroughly racist, overtly racist. They have privileged Israeli lives so much and so pointedly that it cannot, to people who understand what they're doing, it is impossible not to see their racism. And again, though, to other people, it's incredibly possible to just overlook it and go, it's not there. And of course, in both parties, there are just outright racists, I mean, I'm not denying that by any means. I'm just saying that along with those outright racists, there are people who aren't racist who will still go along with their racist policies and convince themselves that it's got nothing to do with racism. So, and particularly the Democrats, they seem to be find it inconceivable that people could not understand the way they see Republicans, but also find it absolutely inconceivable that anyone could possibly have any real meaningful criticism of their own party. It's like somehow you're all just on some weird drug that makes you hallucinate problems with the party. And I mean, the fact is that we know that Donald Trump will be worse on Palestine. So why do you even care about what Kamala Harris says on Palestine? I mean, so and the systems have arisen to create these confusions, and politics has always been about misdirection, a lot of it, but has become much more sophisticated, and they kind of make the intolerable and such an obvious part of their politics, and then get people to sign off on it. That, and then they do it like a confidence trick, really, like using people's fear more than anything else, but also their hatreds and their insecurity, and just panicking them and cajoling them and tricking them any which way they can into signing onto really obnoxious things. But without the other party being the villain for them, it wouldn't work. If they didn't have the other one, neither one could be like that. So they need the threat of the other party. So, yeah. I mean, and the Donald's a gift to the Democrats as well, I mean, because he's so obnoxious. But the thing is, he goes, drill, baby, drill. And when, we are really we're starting to have a very bad time with climate change at the moment. It's starting to really get its claws into us and to kill people. And he's going, drill, baby, drill. And he's calling the Democrats warmongers. at the same time, while Harris is embracing genocide and says she'll always support Israel's right to defend itself in the midst of the slaughter that's happening, going on about Israel's right to defend itself. And the Republicans are gleefully cruel about what they're going to do to immigrants, aggressively cruel. That Tom Homan guy going on about it's horrible. But the reality is that these are rhetorical positions. Both parties have increased oil and gas drilling when they're in power. The US, like the rest, is at peak. It's reaching records every fucking for oil and gas drilling all the time, and it keeps going up. Both of them compete in their unconditional support for Israel, and both of them are campaigning on being tough on immigration, and both will continue to make the lives of undocumented immigrants insecure and cruel. Now, I mentioned last time that I don't think people get this. There is a way to create a legal sovereign immigration policy, but what the US needs to do is put resources into processing asylum applications, because that is legal. Or you can come to the US. They might like to confuse the idea of being undocumented with being illegal, but if you are fleeing persecution, if you intend to apply for asylum, you have every legal right to go to any country you want. They then process and say whether you get asylum or not. That's up to them. But there are. I mean, obviously they've signed on to certain treaties and so forth, so they have to accept refugees under certain circumstances, according to that. But there aren't. I mean, this isn't even talked about as part of the immigration policy, because, of course, they don't really want one. They want a pool of insecure people coming in. They don't want a stable border. So, I right. Well, rather than leaving it till next time, this has already gone on for an hour and a half. I'm going to end it there. I will say this: the answer to the impossibility of dealing with all these double vision things that we have, like the Democrats are the same as the Republicans, but they're not, sort of thing, is to understand that it's the same. There is no difference. They're conjoined. And we have a habit of talking about the uni party as a kind of throwaway thing, and then it never comes into anyone's analysis. So they're not really, there is no analysis of the politics that actually just ignores the shenanigans of each party and says this is the way that that the political powers in the US use a kind of a spectacle of elections, a simulation of elections, if you will, to effect control, to exercise political power. But they should do that. I think that is where we need to go. We need to stop analysing things from this kind of this party this party that perspective. Anyway, so I've got some suggested reading here. So I'm going to start off with The Mold of Yancey, which is a Philip K. Dick story from 1955. It was inspired by Eisenhower's fireside speeches. He could see the fakeness creeping into politics then, and could see how the lens was going. Motion pictures and television were going to deepen that. Well, television in particular. So he wrote The Mold of Yancey, and Yancey is the president of an off-world colony. He's a robot. He only exists from the waist up, and he does all his homilies speaking over a garden fence, if I remember rightly. And in fact, the people behind it is a bunch of advertising and marketing people who are all writing the copy, and that's who runs the politics on that colony. So I think that was a bit of a perspicacious bit of science fiction there. And then another book, a book I'd recommend is Michael Parenti's The Assassination of Julius Caesar, which kind of looks at the way the biases in the writing of classical history, and maybe he's overcompensating. I mean, there's so much that we don't know from that time. We have sources. The sources tended to be plutocratic oligarchs and with a certain slant, and he's looking at it from a different perspective. Now, another book of his is History is Mystery, where he's kind of looking at the biases that exist in history throughout time. So I recommend that. I also want to bring up The Korean War, A History by Bruce Cummings, which just to reflect on stuff I talked about in the last episode. It is Naomi Klein's doppelganger, I already mentioned. Now, Jean Baudrillard, I brought him up. He wrote 3 essays that came out in book form as the Gulf War did not take place, about simulation. I think he's is provoking, I suppose. I don't know. You'd really want to take it too literally what he says, but yeah. There's an interesting thing about Baudrillard. I was doing a creative writing course, and they said, choose a bit of overly ornate language to analyze and simplify it and see how much you can reduce it. And I took a long passage from Baudrillard and started dealing with it. And everything he stated, he then actually qualified it to the point where he hadn't actually stated it. So, in fact, I took a very long paragraph of his and found that he had said nothing at all in it. I don't not necessarily a huge fan of Baudrillard, but interesting thoughts anyway. And another one talking about the right-wing authoritarian psychological perspective. So this is a scale used by psychologists, developed in response to fascism and that sort of thing. There's a book called The Authoritarians by Robert Altemeyer or Bob Altemeyer. It's available for free online, and it's kind of a layperson's summary of his kind of work over the years, I think. And I even noticed when I was checking it out that there's on YouTube you can listen to it being read out by someone as well. So recommend that, and also mention Peter Kuznick's book, The Untold History of the United States, which is also recommended. All right, so thank you, and I will be back in time with part 2 of part 2.